The sun bled into the horizon, melting into the vast savanna beyond Dalangi, staining the sky with hues of deep orange and crimson. The dry earth cracked under the weight of the fading day, and the warm breeze carried the faint, sweet scent of mariela fruits ripening in the distance. Crickets began their nightly hymn, their steady rhythm blending with the muffled beat of drums from the northern huts, a sound that had echoed through the generations, a heartbeat of the village. Children played barefoot, their laughter weaving through the narrow paths between mud brick homes, their voices rising and falling like a chorus of joy. Nearby, elders gathered beneath the sprawling branches of the Baobab de Mwendo, its gnarled roots clutching the soil like the fingers of an ancient guardian. The old tree had stood longer than any villager could remember, whispered to be the resting place of ancestors who watched over Dalangi in silence. But that night, the air changed. The breeze stilled. The crickets faltered. The drums, once steady, grew distant, as if swallowed by the looming dark. A low growl slithered from the shadows, deep, guttural, primal. It sliced through the warmth of the evening like a blade, and the children froze mid-play. Small hands gripped each other tightly. Mothers, sensing the shift, stepped forward, eyes scanning the brush beyond the village's edge. Warriors, some still young, barely men, felt their hearts quicken. Their hands reached for spears, smooth, polished would sharpen with iron, but their grip trembled. Then, the eyes appeared, amber and cold, glowing in the darkness. Not two, not four, but many, a pride, lions, larger and bolder than any had dared approach Dalangi before. They moved like shadows, their bodies low, muscles coiled, breath heavy with hunger. Each step brought them closer. Mothers whispered their children's names, drawing them into their arms. Warriors swallowed their fear, but their feet shifted backward, betraying doubt. The growls grew louder, rumbling from the chests of beasts that knew no mercy. The eldest hunter, Bashiri, his face marked with the lines of battles past, whispered to the nearest warrior, "Bashiri, they are not afraid. They have come to take." A young mother, Abani, clutched her infant to her chest, feeling his heartbeat quicken against hers. "Abani, we must run." But where? Beyond the village, the plains stretched into endless darkness. There was nowhere to hide. Panic crept through the crowd, like fire catching dry grass. The lions pressed forward, their forms clearer now under the silver light of the moon. Teeth bared, claws scraping the earth. Dalangi had faced dangers before. Hyenas in the dry season, leopards lurking by the river, but this was different. The lions did not hesitate. They advanced certain. They had no fear. Then came the thunder, distant at first, a tremor beneath the soil, barely felt. But it grew, heavy, deliberate. Trees cracked. Branches snapped like brittle twigs. The ground shook, not from the paws of predators, but from something greater. Now, the whisper swept through the villagers before they even saw him. The protector, the guardian of Dalangi. From the east, his massive figure broke through the darkness. His tusks, long and curved like ivory sides, caught the moonlight. His ears flared wide, resembling ancient shields. His skin bore the scars of battles long past, scratches from leopards, the mark of a spear once thrown by poachers. But he moved with the power of a king. A trumpet split the night. Loud, defiant, it echoed across the plains, shaking the hearts of both man and beast. Dust erupted beneath his feet as he charged. Lions so fearless before hesitated. Then they scattered, paws kicking up sand as they vanished into the tall grass. For no creature, not even the fiercest predator, dared stand before Ngabu. The villagers stood in silence, breathless. Their fear dissolved into awe. For over 50 years, Ngabu had protected Dalangi, appearing when danger crept too close, driving away threats with his power. To many, he was more than an elephant. He was chosen, a spirit wrapped in flesh, a bridge between their world and the realm of ancestors. But as the dust settled, Akono, the young man standing near the edge of the crowd, noticed something different. Ngabou's steps were slower, his breath heavier. His eyes, once burning with defiance, held a flicker of weariness. Age had begun its quiet battle against the mighty protector. Akono clenched his fist. He had grown up hearing stories of Ngabou, how the elephant had driven off raiders when he was only a child, how he had stood guard when the drought brought predators desperate for food. But this was the first time Akono saw the weight of time pressing on the guardian's shoulders, and it filled him with dread. Amween, the village elder, noticed too. His voice, cracked by age but steady with wisdom, carried a warning only Akono could hear. Amween, the earth changes Akono. Even stone wears under rain. Ngabou has held the storms, but nothing stands forever. Akono felt his chest tighten. He looked back at Ngabou, watching the elephant disappear into the trees. The protector had saved them tonight, but the crack in his strength had been revealed. And in that crack, a new fear was born. Because what happens when the protector can no longer stand? The question lingered like smoke over Ndalangi. And though the lions had fled, the true threat, the one that no spear could pierce, had just begun to take shape. Akono stood still, his breathing shallow, chest rising and falling beneath the thin cloth wrapped around his shoulders. His fingers tightened around the smooth wooden staff, worn by years of his father's grip, now his. The distant thud of Ngabou's footsteps faded into the silence of the night, but Akono's heart continued to pound, as if the lion still lurked in the shadows. He traced the faint cracks along the shaft of the staff, remembering the day his father, Amari, had placed it in his hands, the day he had been told what it meant to be a protector. His father's voice echoed in his mind, low and steady, like the voice of the earth itself. This is not just wood. It is the promise you make to those who come after you. That promise felt heavier now than ever before. The scent of smoke from the fires mixed with the earthy dampness left by the cooling night air. Mothers whispered to their children, soothing them after the terror, while warriors lowered their spears, some exchanging uneasy glances. But Akono's gaze remained fixed on the trail Ngabou had disappeared down. He saw more than footprints. He saw the weight in each step, the slow drag of an aging giant. His chest tightened. Ngabou had saved them. Again, but this time something had been different. The strength was there, but the spirit was flickering like a flame resisting the wind. Akono remembered the first time he truly saw Ngabou, not as a distant figure of legend, but as something more. He had been 8. That day was hotter than most, the kind of heat that made the ground feel like it might crack open and swallow you whole. Akono had wandered too far, chasing a hornbilled bird through the dry grass, his small feet quick but careless. The ground had given way beneath him, and he had tumbled into a ravine, his cries muffled by the thick air. His voice had grown hoarse from screaming. He had waited, trembling, convinced the spirits had decided his time had come. But then the sound, that rumbling sound, not thunder, not drums. It was slower. He had looked up, and there was Ngabou, towering, watching. The elephant had stretched out his trunk, gentle despite his size, and lifted Akono from the depths like a father pulling his son from danger. That night, Akono had knelt before the Baobabdom window, his small hands pressed to the earth, and he had made a silent promise. Ngabou had saved his life. He would spend his own ensuring the elephant was never harmed. But now, years later, that promise felt fragile. Akono's heart was no longer the heart of a boy. It was the heart of a man who understood that even giants could fall. A hand, wrinkled and firm, rested on his shoulder. Amween, the village elder, the voice of wisdom among them. His face, carved by time and sun, bore lines that whispered stories of battles and droughts, of births and deaths. His eyes, though tired, still held the sharpness of someone who saw beyond what others dared to see. He spoke softly, his voice like the rustling of leaves before a storm. Amween, the spirits speak louder tonight, Akono. I heard them when Ngabou roared. His time is near. When he falls, who will stand in his place? The question carved through Akono like a blade. His fingers dug into the staff. He knew what Amween meant, but hearing it spoken made it real. Ngabu was not eternal. The protector was flesh and blood. The end would come, perhaps sooner than anyone was ready to accept. Akono's throat tightened, his thoughts raced, searching for something, anything to deny what he knew to be true. He looked into Amween's eyes, hoping to find doubt, but saw only certainty. For Amween had seen this before. He had seen great warriors succumb to age. He had buried friends who once seemed unbreakable. He understood the cycle of life in ways Akono was only beginning to grasp. Akono, he will not leave us. I will find a way. His voice was firm, but there was a crack beneath it, a crack Amween noticed. The elder's gaze softened, but he said nothing more. He squeezed Akono's shoulder once and walked away, disappearing into the shadows beneath the baobab. Akono stayed. Alone, he stared into the darkness where Ngabu had vanished. His mind returned to that day in the ravine. He could still feel the rough texture of Ngabu's trunk, the strength that had lifted him when he was most helpless. That strength had not wavered then, but tonight it had. The crack was growing, and Akono was afraid. The night stretched on, but sleep did not come. His thoughts twisted like the roots of the great tree above him. What if the lions returned, and Ngabu could no longer rise? What if the protector fell, and the village was left exposed? He imagined his mother, his younger sister, Naira, and the children, helpless as the lions prowled. He imagined the silence that would follow, the emptiness. No, that would not happen. His grip on the staff tightened until his knuckles turned white. The promise he had made as a child burned hotter within him. It was no longer a vow whispered in innocence. It was a duty. But how does a man protect a god? A gust of wind brushed against his face, carrying with it the distant sound of an elephant's call. Faint, but clear. It was Ngabu. Akono closed his eyes. That sound, once a comfort, now held a different weight. It was a reminder. Ngabu was still there. But for how long? Akono's heart whispered the question he dared not speak aloud. When the time came, would he be ready? He did not know, but he knew one thing. He would not let Ngabu fall alone. The sun was high over Ndalanji, casting sharp rays that turned the earth beneath the villagers' feet into a searing mosaic of cracked soil. The wind carried the faint scent of dry acacia and the distant stench of carrion, remnants of a hunt far from their land. Life had begun to settle after the night of the lions, but the unease lingered. The children no longer strayed far from their mothers. Warriors sharpened their spears more often, their eyes drifting toward the brush, as if expecting those glowing eyes to return at any moment. Akono walked near the fields, his staff in hand, when he noticed something unusual. A figure approached from the west, cutting through the heat haze. His stride was confident, deliberate. His skin was darker than that of the villagers, his shoulders broad, and his face bore scars, marks that whispered of survival, not accidents. His garments were different, woven with patterns unfamiliar to Ndalanji, dyed with the deep hues of distant lands. Around his neck hung a string of teeth, lion, leopard, something larger that Akono could not name. The stranger's eyes were sharp, like a blade, glinting in sunlight. The village gathered as he entered, curiosity mixed with caution. Visitors were rare. Those who came often sought trade, news, or shelter from the harshness beyond. But this man moved with the presence of someone who did not ask. He took. His name was Chamari. His voice was deep, his accent cutting, the vowels stretched and the consonants clipped. He spoke of the lands beyond the savannas, the DW, a place the elders mentioned only in whispers. A place where men hunted beasts not for food, but for wealth. He carried gifts, salt wrapped in cloth, beads that shimmered like water under moonlight, iron tools that made the farmer's eyes widen with longing. He laid them out slowly, letting the villagers see what they had only dreamed of holding. But his gaze was not on their faces. It was on something beyond them, something older, larger, more valuable than any salt or bead. Chamari, I have heard of the great elephant. Ngabu, his tusks, they are worth more than this entire village. The word struck like a spear to the chest. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Mothers clutched their children, not out of fear, but shock. Warriors gripped their spears tighter, though their eyes betrayed uncertainty. Even Amwine, wise and composed, stiffened. Akono felt his heart race. He stepped forward before anyone else could speak. His voice was firm, but there was fire beneath it. Akono, Gabu is not a prize. He is our protector. His words hung in the air, but Shamari did not flinch. Instead, he smiled, a thin, knowing curve of his lips. Shamari, protector or prisoner of your fear? Elephants grow old. They grow weak. One day he will fall, and the lions will return. Will you all die, clinging to an aging beast? His words cut deeper than any spear. Warriors exchanged uneasy glances. Women murmured. The doubt was spreading, fast like a wound left open in the sun. Akono's jaw tightened. He could see it, the crack in their unity. The same fear that had brushed his own heart days ago was now being fed, twisted into something dangerous. But before he could speak again, Amwine raised his hand, his voice steady, though his eyes bore the weight of generations. Amwine, Gabu was not just an elephant. He is part of us. His words carried the truth of the ancestors, but for the first time, they did not silence the whispers. Shamari had planted something that would not be easily uprooted. That night, the village was quieter than usual. Fires burned lower. Families gathered closer. Akono sat alone beneath the Baobabdom window, his staff resting across his lap. He thought of his father, how he would have stood before the village unshaken. But Omari was gone, and now the burden was his. The weight of his promise pressed harder. When the village slept, Akono did not. He walked beyond the huts, past the fields, to the outskirts where the grass grew tall and the air smelled of damp earth. There, under the acacia Mzuri, he found Gabu. The elephant was resting. His massive body leaned against the tree, his breathing slow, heavy. The moonlight revealed what others refused to see. Gabu's ribs pressed faintly beneath his skin. His eyes, once burning with defiance, now held the weariness of a king who had fought too many battles. Akono knelt beside him, his hand brushing the rough, wrinkled skin. He spoke softly, though his voice trembled. Akono, they do not see what I see, but I will not let them harm you. Gabu's eyes shifted, meeting Akono's gaze. In that moment, no words were needed. The bond was not of man and beast, it was of brothers. Gabu had saved Akono's life once. Now, it was Akono's turn. But as he looked in Gabu's eyes, he realized the fight ahead would not be against the lions or hunters. It would be against his own people, against doubt, against time, and he was not sure he would win. The first light of dawn crept over Ndalangi, but it brought no comfort. The air, usually cool in the early hours, felt heavy, as though the earth itself carried a burden. Smoke from the dying embers of the village fires lingered, mixing with the faint scent of damp grass and the musky odor of livestock. The voices of the villagers were quieter than usual. Whispers of Shamari's words from the day before still circled like vultures over a wounded beast. Doubt had rooted itself in hearts that once stood united. But for Akono, there was no room for doubt, only urgency. His steps were brisk as he made his way toward the edge of the village, where the home of Mabini, the seer, lay half-buried under twisted branches and vines. Her hut was different from the others, older, darker, as though it had been shaped by time itself. The entrance was marked by bones tied with dried reeds, swaying gently in the breeze, making a faint clattering sound that seemed to speak a language known only to the spirits. Akono's heart quickened as he stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of herbs, bitter and sweet, blended with the charred scent of birdwood. Animal bones were scattered across the floor, some small, others disturbingly large. Dried roots hung from the ceiling, brushing against his shoulders as he moved forward. Symbols, ancient, unfamiliar, were etched into the walls, spiraling patterns that seemed to pulse under the dim light of the smoldering fire at the center of the room. Mabini was there, crouched by the flames. Her skin was as dark as the soil after rain. her eyes clouded with the weight of wisdom and years. Lines ran across her face like the cracks of the earth, but her presence was strong, commanding, yet patient. She did not look up when Akono entered. Her fingers traced over the bones in front of her, feeling their shape as though reading their secrets. "Mabini, you carry questions, Akono, but the spirits do not speak to those who rush." Her voice was low, raspy, like the wind through dry leaves. It held the weight of someone who had seen what others dared not. Akono swallowed, forcing himself to breathe slower. He knelt beside her, his knees pressing into the cool, hardened earth. His voice trembled, but his resolve held firm. "Akono, Gaba, there is more to him, isn't there?" Finally, Mabini raised her gaze to meet his. Her eyes were sharp beneath the misty veil of age. She leaned closer to the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering light. "Mabini, Gabu is not just an elephant. He carries the mark of the ancients." The word struck Akono like a blow. He had heard whispers of the ancients as a child, stories shared in hushed tones during storms. Beings who walked the earth when the bond between man and beast was unbroken. Protectors who lived alongside the great creatures, not as masters, but as brothers. But those were tales, legends meant to comfort frightened children. Or so he thought. Mabini reached into a clay jar and withdrew a small wooden carving. It was age cracked along the edges, but the details were clear. An elephant towering, with a symbol carved onto its forehead. A spiral encased in lines that resembled roots. Akono's breath caught in his throat. He had seen that mark before. On Gabo, a faint scar, right above his brow, barely visible unless one knew where to look. "Akono, the scar, it's the same." Mabini nodded slowly. "Mabini, Gaba did not wander into our land by chance. He chose us. He is the bridge between our world and theirs. He carries the spirits of the ancients with him. That is why the lions fear him. That is why death bows before him." Akono felt his heart pounding louder with each word. But there was more. He could see it in Mabini's eyes. A shadow of warning. "Mabini, but know this. When Gaba's time ends, the bond must pass. If it breaks, if the village turns from him, darkness will swallow Ndalanji. The lions, they will be the first, but others will follow. Famine, disease. The earth itself will close its hand around us." The words hung in the air, heavy like the smoke from the fire. Akono trembled. His mind raced with images. Gabu fallen, the lions returning, the fields turning to dust. He saw his sister Naira, her small hands reaching for help that would never come. He saw his mother's eyes, filled with fear instead of warmth. He saw his home, empty, silent. "Akono, what must I do?" His voice cracked, but it was not weakness, it was desperation. Mabinti leaned back, her eyes narrowing as though peering beyond the walls of her hut into something far greater. "Mabini, you must prepare. Gabo's spirit can live on, but only if the village is ready to receive it. The bond does not choose the strong, it chooses the willing. When the moment comes, someone must stand where Ngabo falls and call upon the ancients. If none answer, all will be lost." Akono gripped his staff tighter. He understood. This was not just about protecting Gabu from Chamari. It was about preserving what Ngabu represented, the thread that held their world together. But could he make the others see? The doubt had already poisoned some. Would they listen when the time came, or would fear drive them apart? The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air like fleeting stars. "Mabini, the choice is not yours alone, Akono. It is theirs, but you must lead them to it." A weight settled on Akono's chest. He had come seeking answers, but he had found a burden far greater than he expected. His promise to Ngabu had grown into something larger, something that held the fate of every soul in Ndalanji. And somewhere beyond the village, the sound of distant footsteps echoed in the plains. Heavy, slow, Ngabu was still there. But for how long? The moon hung full and swollen over Ndalanji, casting a pale light over the dry earth that cracked like aged skin beneath bare feet. A month had passed since the hunter's arrival. but his shadow lingered over the village like a curse. Whispers of doubt still clung to the walls of the huts, even as life attempted to return to its fragile rhythm. Yet, those who looked closely could see it. Beneath the surface, the spirit of the village had begun to fracture. The old certainty, the faith in Gabu, now carried hesitation. And the earth knew it. That night, the stillness was different. The breeze, usually carrying the soft hum of crickets and the rustling of acacia leaves, was absent. The air was tight, heavy, as though it held its breath. A faint scent of rot drifted from the plains beyond. The smell of death carried from somewhere far, yet close enough to warn those who knew the language of the wild. Then the growls returned, low, guttural, vibrating through the ground before reaching the ears. They were different from the last time, bolder, louder, hungry. Lions, not a few, a pride, larger than before. Their forms slithered through the tall grass, golden eyes flickering like distant fireflies, but without warmth. These were not the same beasts who fled from Gaba weeks prior. These had returned with knowledge. They had tasted the weakness in the protector, and tonight they came to finish what they had begun. The first scream came from the outer fields, a herder boy who dropped his bundle of reeds as a shadow lunged at his goats. The animals scattered in panic, but one did not make it. The boy ran, breathless, his voice cutting the night like a blade. Akono was the first to rise, gripping his spear. His heart was already racing before his feet touched the ground. His thoughts snapped to Ngabu, and a dread he had tried to bury surfaced like a sickness. He sprinted toward the outskirts of the village, past the watch fires now burning low. Behind him, men stirred, some grabbing weapons, others frozen, the doubt planted by Chamari still anchoring their feet. At the edge of the field, Ngaba stood, but he was not the same. The great elephant lifted his head, ears flaring, but his movements were slower, his breaths labored. His eyes, once burning with defiance, flickered with pain. He let out a trumpet, but it was strained, thinner than the mighty call that once shook the ground. Akono felt his throat tighten. This was what he had feared. The protector's strength was waning. But the lions, they had no such weakness. Their forms emerged from the darkness, more than a dozen, muscles tense, teeth bared, moving as a single force. Predators who had tasted hesitation in return to claim their prize. The circle began to close. Akono's voice cut through the night. Akono, stand with me. But the warriors who gathered behind him hesitated. Their grip on their spears was uncertain. The doubt had grown roots in their hearts. They had heard Chamari's words again and again. One day, he will fall. Will you all die clinging to an aging beast? And now, that day seemed to stand before them. Feet shuffled backward, breaths quickened. Even Akono felt fear gnawing at his resolve. The lions crept closer. Each second stolen by hesitation was another inch given to death. Then, Amween's voice rose, sharp and unyielding like stone. Amween, for Ngabu, the elder staff struck the ground, and in that sound, there was no doubt, only command. His eyes pierced through the crowd, not with anger, but with the weight of a man who had seen the strength of unity and the ruin of division. His voice carried the memory of ancestors who had built Ndalanji not with fear, but with faith. The warriors snapped from their trance. They stepped forward, spears raised, shoulders aligned. Fear still clung to their bones, but it was bound by something stronger, duty. The line formed, not perfect, not fearless, but together. Ngabu lifted his head once more. His old eyes met Akono's. The bond, silent yet unbreakable, spoke louder than words. For the final time, they would stand as one. The charge began. Ngabu surged forward, his feet pounding the earth, stirring clouds of dust. The lion sprang. Teeth met tusk. Claws scraped against thick skin. Warriors thrust their spears, the sounds of snarls mixing with the battle cries of men. The ground became chaos, dust, blood, and desperate breaths. A lion lunged toward Akono, teeth snapping inches from his chest, but his spear met flesh. The beast recoiled, wounded but not defeated. Another charged Ngabu's flank, but the elephant swung his massive trunk, sending it sprawling. For a moment, it seemed as though they were winning, holding the line. The lines began to falter. But then, Ngabu stumbled. His back leg gave way, his massive form wavered. He pushed forward, but his breath came in ragged gasps. Each step drained him more. The weight of years, the battles, the burdens, now bore down on him. Then he collapsed. The sound of his fall silenced everything. The lions froze. The warriors stood still. Even the wind seemed to halt, as though the earth itself grieved. Akono dropped a spear and ran to Ngabu's side. His knees hit the ground. His hands pressed against the elephant's rough skin, feeling the warmth that was already beginning to fade. Tears mixed with the dust beneath him. "Akono, you cannot leave us." His voice cracked, breaking under the weight of sorrow and desperation. His fingers traced the faint scar, the mark of the ancients, on Ngabu's forehead. That symbol, once a sign of strength, now seemed like a cruel reminder of what was slipping away. Ngabu's trunk moved, slow, gentle, brushing Akono's hand, just as it had all those years ago, when he was a boy trapped in the ravine. It was not a gesture of power. It was a farewell. With one final breath, Ngabu, the protector of Ndalangi, the bridge between man and beast, rested. Silence claimed the night. But it was not the silence of victory. It was the silence before something far greater. The first light of dawn spread over Ndalangi, gentle but heavy with sorrow. The air was cool, laced with the faint scent of damp earth and the fading embers of the night's fires. The village stood, but its heart was different. Beneath the ancient Baobab window, the mound of soil remained fresh, covering the resting place of Ngabu, their protector, their brother. His tusks, untouched, gleamed softly under the branches, a final tribute to a life given for them. Children watched in silence. Mothers pressed their hands to their chests, and warriors stood with lowered spears. Grief mixed with gratitude. Akono stepped forward, the carved pendant of the ancients resting against his chest, its spiral mark warming against his skin like a heartbeat. His voice carried across the village, steady but trembling with emotion. "Akono, Ngabu gave his life for us, but his spirit remains. In every step we take, in every child's laughter, in every sunrise." Heads bowed, some wept, others held their breath, clinging to his words as though they could shield them from the uncertain future. But the bond was not broken. Though their protector had fallen, his spirit lingered in the roots of the Baobab, in the dust beneath their feet, in their hearts. Life continued. Warriors patrolled with watchful eyes, and children returned to their games, though their laughter carried traces of caution. Akono trained harder, his calloused hands tightening around his spear, knowing the burden he carried was no longer his alone. It was the weight of every soul in Ndalangi. Years passed. Wrinkles etched their way onto Akono's face, and his once dark hair bore streaks of gray, but his eyes remained sharp, always searching, always listening. Then, on a day when the sun hummed low over the plains, a cry rang out. Children pointed to the horizon. Women gasped. Warriors prepared for battle. But what approached was not death. It was life. A young elephant, smaller than Ngabu, but strong. His steps were steady, his gaze calm, and on his brow, a scar. Faint but unmistakable. The spiral of the ancients. The village gathered in awe. Akono's heart pounded as he stepped forward, his hand outstretched. The elephant raised his trunk, brushing it gently against his palm. In that touch, Akono felt it, the bond reborn. He smiled. The spirit of Ngabu had never left. It had merely found a new vessel. Protector in village, forever as one. If you enjoyed this video, please help us grow by subscribing to this humble channel. And if you'd like to watch more videos like this, we prepared the next video especially for you. Click here to watch.